Hello. Hi. How you doing? I'm Colonel Matt Hardman. I'm the current commander of Operations Group at the Joint Readiness Training Center. Thanks for joining us. We're going to have a great discussion. I know we're going to have a great discussion because I had the opportunity to interview everyone participating in the panel today. And for many of them, I ended up talking to them for well over an hour about our profession and what we do. And specifically, what we do at the Joint Readiness Training Center and have done in the past at the Joint Readiness Training Center to prepare our formations to fight and win the first battle. And the combat training centers really are the antidote to America's first battle. We get to go in that environment, complex environment, and make all the mistakes there so that we don't make them in combat. And we're fortunate today. We've got Major General Bernabe, the former commander of 1st Armored Division, getting ready to take command of 3rd Corps. And he was the commander of Operations Group from 2016 to 2017. On the line, we have Major General Doyle, the previous COG at JRTC from 2017 to 2018. Currently the Chief of Staff at CENTCOM. That's why he's not here, because he's working really, really hard right now. And was previously also the CG at Fort Polk. We've got Brigadier General Gardner. He was the commander of Operations Group from 2018 to 2020 and is currently the commanding general at JRTC in Fort Polk. To the far left, Brigadier General Curl was a COG from 2020 to 2021 and my neighbor down at Fort Polk, and is currently the Deputy Commanding General of Operations at 10th Mountain Division. And then also online, we've got Colonel Saslov. He's the current DCGO for the 82nd Airborne Division and was the COG at JRTC from 2021 until July of 2022 here. So a great team of people that have a breadth of experience, and really the breadth of experience over time as our Army has transitioned to focusing on large-scale combat operations from previously mission readiness exercises preparing for the global war on terrorism. And so the change over time, as well as the continuities, is I think an important theme and part of the discussion here. You have the trends in front of you, and that's really driven a lot of the discussions that we've had in preparation for this. And so I'll start really with the first question and open up for the group is how do you envision the IBCT's role within the operational concept of multi-domain operations? And General Bernabe, we'll start with you, sir.
Thanks, Matt. So Matt was actually pretty brilliant in how he put this together, and having us do interviews with him beforehand, it was really kind of forcing us to think about this and to prepare. And in my case, it forced me to go find some things from my archives and pull those to the forefront and spend some time contemplating some of these topics. So I'm a bit of an anomaly in the sense that I was a COG at JRTC, and then since then I spent probably more time looking at SBCTs and ABCTs than I have IBCTs. But as a division commander preparing for a warfighter and fighting Warfighter 21-4, we did have a chance to think about how would we employ the IBCT in a large-scale combat operation on the European continent. And by the nature of that exercise, it was designed to start to touch multi-domain operations. Multi-domain operations was still very much a concept a couple of years ago. We're on the verge of calling it doctrine, our operating concept. I'm sorry, our operating doctrine here in a couple of weeks. But even back then, 2 years ago, we were starting to toy with how we would execute multi-domain operations. And in fact, our division was equipped with some of the types of things that we're trying to develop to enable a multi-domain fight and multi-domain dominance. So as a division commander trying to figure out how to employ ABCTs, SBCTs, and IBCTs, frankly, not a lot changed in terms of the role of the IBCT. And we heard a lot about this the other day, actually from a couple of speakers, as they talked about, hey, infantry forces are going to fight in restricted terrain. They're going to fight in urban centers. Now, for a division commander who's fighting a very fast-paced, multi-domain fight, what is the dilemma? What is the challenge for the IBCT? Well, how do you get that key capability where you need it, when you need it? That's tough. We talk about vertical envelopment. We talk about, well, maybe we're going to drop paratroopers in on the far side of the wet gap. Perhaps we're going to air assault with rotary wing to the far side of the wet gap. Maybe. That becomes a high-risk endeavor, and perhaps, given the enemy's capabilities, not something we want to try. And so I think part of the message for the IBCTs, and JRTC does well to bring this out, is you got to be able to get your combat power where you need it when the commander needs it. It's part of the interview. One of the things Matt asked me, he said, so how did JRTC change during my tenure to meet the demands of the current environment? One of the things General Abrams directed, General Abrams was the FORSCOM commander at the time. One of the things he directed, he said, hey, Sean, you need to bring the tyranny of distance to the JRTC. We talked about the differences between the training centers, and I had done rotations at all three of them. One of the big differences at the time when you looked at NTC versus JRTC, and by the way, I've been out to NTC as a light infantryman. And what does that look like? A whole lot of walking. NTC had the tyranny of distance. Well, we didn't really have it as much at JRTC. It was a very small piece of terrain relatively. And so he said, I want you to figure out how to do it, how to add that in. So if you've been there lately, we bought up a bunch of land to the north, and we connected the box at JRTC with Peace on Ridge live fire area. And we told IBCTs, you got to get all the way up there by this time hack, or you're irrelevant. That's when the division needs you there. I remember some battalion commanders looking at me as the cog saying, how am I supposed to do that, sir? I only have 10 trucks, or I don't have any trucks. And I would say, hey, look at these. Start walking. And then we get back to fitness and lightening the load and using things like shuttle marches. How many of you are familiar with a shuttle march technique? Well, that's a World War II technique where you take the few trucks you have and your troops, a third of your troops walk to a certain point, a third of them get driven to a certain point, get dropped off, and you do that drill until you get to your objective. So it was things like that to remind IBCTs that one of the fundamental challenges is getting you to the fight. Now, obviously, brigades and divisions, in that kind of fight, a division has to figure out how are we going to get this IBCT where we need them, want them. But frankly, quite often it's going to be a combination of fitness, foot marching, shuttle marches, perhaps helicopter movement, not to the X, but to some offset to then allow you to make the final move to where we need you. Here's the other thing that I think comes out of that whole discussion. I don't think as we went through the warfighter, any of those IBCTs were pure when it came time to fight. So we task organized. And so each and every one of those ended up being a combined arms brigade combat team. And so a lesson there for IBCT staffs is you better be ready to integrate a combined arms battalion because you're going to need them as you go into that urban area. You're going to need them, as we punch you through restricted terrain. And as you look at places like Eastern Europe, when I see that terrain, I see a big defile drill. Everybody familiar with a defile drill? We practiced that a fair amount in Korea. That's a key to survival and a key to success in a place like Eastern Europe, for example. And that begs the armor infantry team. And it goes right back to what I said. It's going to be a task organized combined arms team in the end. So what is the role of the IBCT in multi-domain operations? I'm not sure it changes. We're going to still have the challenge of how do we get the IBCT where we need them, when we need them. But the other reality is as always, we're going to task organize for the fight. So be ready to employ strikers and tanks and some type of fighting vehicle and whatever else we develop as we march through time. Anyone else have any thoughts on that one?
Sure. I think you hit that well. The one thing I would talk about is my experience as the COG. We had a brigade come through And every once in a while, I'd have a IBCT commander complain to me that they were fighting against an enemy, either motorized or mechanized formation as part of the rotation. And I think Command Sergeant Major Wilson in the crowd was with me. And we'd say, well, yeah, you are supposed to hold restrictive terrain, and you're supposed to be able to do that. In that rotation, one young kid with one javelin took out 3 tanks himself. I mean, it is possible for well-placed infantry by a great company commander and platoon leader, platoon sergeant to rain the dickens on armor formations coming through. So I'm not ready to throw out 2,000 years of history. If you read Keegan's History of Warfare, I mean, infantry's never been one of those that's gone up and down. We've always had different roles, but I think we're going to maintain a pretty critical role, if not always decisive in certain battles.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is one of the critical things for IBCTs in this fight, and it's becoming even more critical, is protection and being able to camouflage ourselves from in the electromagnetic, being able to camouflage ourselves in the from visual, and a lot of it is how we blend into built-up areas, how we blend into wooded areas, and how we disperse our command posts. The other thing is protecting our networks against a lot of the threats we face. In the past, Dronmo would go through and when they got prisoners, they take their graphics and their orders and all of that stuff. Now they don't even need to do that, because in a lot of cases, they'll just go in to your networks and go through your files, read all your orders, read all your graphics online. So being able, in multi-domain operations, being able to protect our networks and our CPs.
General Doyle, anything from your end, or you want to wait for a follow-on question?
Yeah, the comments you made sit well with the leadership component of it, because if an IBCT is going to be relevant, you're going to have staff that can do what General Bernabe said, which is accept task organization changes. You're going to have staff that can think through protection problems when the enemy confronts them with different capabilities. So an IBCT's relevance in multi-domain operations is really going to be contingent on how well we prepare the leaders to understand that role, to understand what resources are out there, what challenges are out there, and then to think through integration. Thank you.
Colonel Saslov, anything to add? So my next question for the panel is and by the way, so the questions for these, we did a survey up front. We got a bunch of great questions. We synthesized these questions, or I did, into about 10 questions to drive the discussion. So we did listen to your survey, tried to synthesize these together. So my next question, and it really going down a bit, is the IBCT within the division as the division becomes a unit of action, and how do you see the BCT's fight within the division as a unit of action?
Start again.
Yes, sir.
Hey, Dave, you wanna take a crack at it first?
I really appreciate that, sir. Yeah, the interesting thing that JRTC has been able to do with the 21st Airborne Division, or CJTF 21, is incorporate the DTAC construct, so division headquarters, into the rotation. And the most successful units will employ their battle rhythm, employ their SOPs, employ their comms architecture, and then compel the IBCT in question to conform to what the division is going to do when it deploys, because the division is going to be the centerpiece. And I think some corps commanders might argue that because they'll take toys and tools and use it for their purposes, but you're going to see divisions, my expectation, looking at what we see in Ukraine and other places, play an enormously important role. So what the IBCT's got to do is recognize they're not the only show in town. And so JRTC has been very aggressive in framing that. So the BCT commander is in fact the training audience. He is not driving things. He's being driven, and I think that bodes well for what Colonel Hardman said about being able to fight successfully in America's first battles. Thanks.
Yeah, so we just heard General Pappas talking about how we're going to have to change the way we train. So we've talked a lot about how these rotations must start to incorporate division CPs. Seeing this coming, we actually planned a rotation at NTC. We started the planning about 6 months ago. And you heard General Pappas refer to Jim Eisenhower, the commander of 1st Armored Division, and the rotation they just finished, where they took the division CPs out to the National Training Center in conjunction with 21AD, and ensured that, number one, that we remember how to deploy all the nodes for the division, but also that they're practiced in the dirt in a desert environment, and that they get the reps and sets they need to see to a fight. Now, we designed that rotation in such a way that it did no harm to the brigade. The brigade remains the primary training audience, but it also set up in such a way that if the brigade is ready, or if they need some pressure from the division headquarters was in the position to do that and to make sure they got to the training results that everyone was looking for. Seems like it worked pretty well, and I think it's a good interim step for where I think things are going. A model I propose is that, perhaps a division in the first year of a division commander's tenure does a warfighter exercise, command post exercise, like the way we do it now, and maybe in the second year, then they deploy and do a dirt warfighter out at a CTC and get those reps and sets out there, as one potential long-term approach. I think the other thing we have to think about, we've heard as we talk about the enemy, talk about the Russian threat. If people describe the Russians as an artillery force with tanks, there's no doubt in terms of mass and in terms of range, we've got a pretty tough challenge there. And so what we found in Warfighter 21-4 at the division level, the cannons that reside in the brigade combat teams very quickly became attractive to the division commander, who told those brigade commanders, say, those cannons are not yours, they're mine. Your job, brigade commander, is to position them, to secure them, make sure you don't lose them. We only have 18. And to sustain them, make sure you got all the rounds we need, the right rounds in the right place at the right time, to enable the division fires plan. So that I can set conditions for you, brigade commander, so that I can set conditions for brigade success. So I can set conditions with fires for brigade maneuver. Now, ideally, it sure would be great if the division also had cannons. In an environment where that's not the case, that was the easy answer. Let's tell the brigade, those are mine. You position them, I shoot them. A better solution long-term would be cannons at the brigade, cannons at the division, rockets, and maybe even extended range cannons at the division, and we fight a fires fight together. But I think that's a good model in the interim as we go forward to get divisions a chance to practice and to remind brigades that you may be enabling a division fires plan. You're part of a bigger operation. Tied to that, attack aviation. What's a division commander's #1 killing machine? It's not the M1 tank. It's not the Bradley. It's not the rifle battalion or squad. I mean, it's the AH-64 Apache. If conditions are properly set and if put in the right place, they could wreak havoc. Very capable system. By the way, with some of the things we're working on the modernization front, will be even more lethal. So the days of air weapons teams over the shoulder providing support to BCT formations are gone, or at least they're not there right now. And so we've created some bad habits, I think. Now it's good practice for company commanders and battalion commanders to learn to practice integrating other capabilities. So don't get me wrong. We need to continue to think about that and practice it. But we've created this false expectation in our IBCTs, SBTs, and ABCTs that company commanders and battalion commanders are going to have Apache helicopters sitting over their shoulder. That is not going to be the case. The division commanders can't afford to do that. The corps commanders can't afford to use that asset in that way. And so I think as we design our rotations and we look at how we use the aviation task forces, we ought to shape rotations in that way. First Armored Division's rotation was shaped just like that. The aviation task force was present. They were flying missions deep in support of the division condition setting plan as opposed to in support of the brigade. So again, just a couple of thoughts on how the rotations might change to reflect the division as a unit of action.
Just a quick one on that. If you're a company commander sitting here, like you're not losing your Crucible event at the JRTC or even at the National Training Center. You know, when the National Training Center has done it, they've typically done it separately from the rotation. In February of 19, General Schmidt, I think it was. So we brought Ted Mountain down. So we've done 4 or 5 division TACs. The 82nd has been doing it for a long time to be able to see to the forcible entry. And so we are able to do that at CTCs without impacting company commander or training objectives. It's pretty well firewall.
The number one operating principle is do no harm to the rotation. And so the COGs have got very good at putting up that firewall so that you don't have a division sending the brigade off on a crazy tangent that's going to completely disrupt the training plan.
Thanks, gentlemen. For General Curl, so you've been the DCGO for now a little over a year. You've been failed by certain brigade commanders, or third brigade, sitting right here. How does personnel, equipment readiness, and then equipment on hand habits translate to true training proficiency?
Yeah, so I think for all of you who are going to be company commanders and platoon leaders or first sergeants, I think the critical thing is you really got to start with P, and it goes P, R, S, and T in that order for a reason. If you don't have the right personnel and your personnel aren't available to work, train, deploy, then you can't maintain your equipment properly because you don't have the right people to do it. You can't account for your equipment properly, and you can't train effectively. If you don't account for your equipment, you don't have the right equipment, and you don't maintain it correctly, then you aren't going to be able to train effectively. We've all sat at AARs for live fires where we do more talking about, well, if these machine guns hadn't gone down, then we would have been more effective. Or if we had the right BII for this piece of equipment, we could have used it more effectively. Instead of talking about the synchronization of fire and maneuver at the critical pieces in a fight. And then in the fight, in a JRTC rotation or in a combat operation, thinking about prioritization of moving personnel forward, moving equipment forward, who does the priority, who's setting the priorities for what to move forward, and then what you're using to secure those assets. We talked about IBCT's role. Some of it may be securing our rear area so that we can move equipment forward. Dedicating the right assets, dedicating the right lift assets, whether those are ground or air assets, to get those critical pieces forward. So if we don't start with who we need and what we need, we aren't really going to be able to train and conduct operations effectively.
General Doyle, or do you have anything to add, sir?
Hey, if Colonel Sadlov's up on the net, he's a great example of a unit that maintained a high level of readiness and then was able to respond as an IBCT to perform a function in a combat environment. So, from Andy's perspective, if you're on and you want to talk about what you witnessed and then how you saw that translate into the most effective units that go through RSOI or JRTC, I'd really be interested in that perspective if he's there.
Yeah, sir, I'm up. Can you hear me?
Can you guys hear in the back?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Andy.
So, I think to start with the COGS original question and tie into your point, sir, it's important for us all to remember the Army has designed each each of our organizations for a specific purpose, and it equipped us for that purpose. What we see often, I think, at the training centers is units arrive with the equipment that they take to the range every day. They don't arrive with the equipment, and leaders aren't inspecting the equipment that is in that organization to achieve its purpose as directed by the Army. And I think that's really what the huge takeaway from RSO&I is, right? The RSO&I process that helps us get our equipment ready, but really it helps leaders understand how they align their systems to have functional equipment that meets the Army's purpose. And, you know, a story I told at almost every RSO&I is, you know, we went through the process when I was brigade commander at JRTC. You know, I think we took a lot of great things out of that. But my takeaway from the RSO&I process was still that it was this thing at JRTC really to cause some friction inside the chain of command and you know, highlight some gaps we had. And we didn't take that process with us. And so, you know, when we had to rapidly deploy, the systems that we used every day and the systems that we had, we found utility in maintaining them, and I think we maintained a good process to get them out the door, and that saved us hours and hours of time. You know, the first battalion had to be ready in 18 hours, and it was ready in, I think, 16 hours, and we waited on lift. But halfway across the Atlantic Ocean, that battalion commander called me from the aircraft and said, you know, I just realized that some of my attachments are missing critical equipment, and it's because we didn't take that RSO&I process, and we didn't think about equipping for purpose, as you know, as Colonel Carl talked about with you know, or General Carl, I'm sorry, talked about with, you know, you have this P, and then you equip that P. We hadn't gone through that process, and so the Army designed you for a reason, and understanding what that is and bringing that equipment, I think, is critically important. And then, you know, use the processes at the CTC to help you shape how you're going to maintain and outload your formation in crisis.
There might be some folks here who aren't familiar with the term RSOI, especially our young lieutenants. Reception, staging, onward movement, integration. So the process a unit goes through is it arrives in a theater to receive all of its personnel equipment, stage it, move it to the point for final preparation, and then integrate it into the rest of the fighting force. It's a very complex process. Very, you know, time is never gonna have enough time to do it. The enemy is probably gonna be putting pressure on you as you're doing it. And as highlighted by a couple of these former COGs, it's not just a CTC way to induce pressure, it's a reality. We send brigade combat teams to the Korean Peninsula, they conduct RSOI in a very new and different environment under pressure. When we sent 1st Brigade 3ID to Europe to respond to the Ukrainian crisis, they were absolutely doing RSOI spread between a couple different ports. And by the way, adding an additional ingredient of drawing Army prepositioned stocks and then moving it to then qualify off of it. So, you know, a very important process and something that we must sustain at the training centers. It's a key training event.
Thanks, John. So for General Gardner, in focusing on large-scale combat operations, where do you think we've made the most growth in changing behaviors and habits? And then where do you think we remain challenged?
So I think one of the areas that I've seen growth, and I kind of date it back to about 2014 or so when I was able to start seeing it, is I think in the last, whatever that is, 8 years, I think we have a much better appreciation through our professional military education, our self-development, which is part of leader development, you know, what you guys are reading, and then what we're teaching at leader training program, et cetera, to understand the specific details by warfighting function that are required to succeed in decisive action. You know, that's important. It's important you come out of PME as a company commander understanding when we talk about detailed planning, even at the company level, And that may be on a pre-formatted thing that you're going to brief verbally, but what are the details I got to cover as a company commander? I think we're much better off and we've grown a lot. I think we also understand the fundamentals. We have to pull security. We have to dig in. We have to integrate with adjacent units, right? I'm talking about company command level things. We have to plan and issue an order. We have to do a map with good fire control measures and good graphics. I think the two areas that we need to improve in is take that next step. One is to have the discipline to do those things I just said. When you're a company commander, you know, we always used to talk about the team leader is the busiest person in the Army, because as soon as the platoon takes a halt and everybody does a flop, to include the platoon leader with the radio, the team leader, the first thing he's doing is checking soldiers, right? And by the time the team leader's ready to flop, it's time to move again. Well, company commander is the same thing. As soon as we're there, probably got to write another order, probably got to check with adjacent units, probably got to look at the sector sketch, right? So that discipline to do those things that are hard routinely. The second thing, because some of you will find yourselves on staffs, is we know our details, but I feel like we're coloring on different pages in the coloring book, and we're trying to put it back together, right? You know, we got the fires guys go off over here, and the engineers go off over here, and the maneuver folks stay here. And then we wonder why we get through the war game, we get to the plan, and the target is like 200 meters from where we changed the obstacle at the last minute. And oh, by the way, the Apaches didn't get the word to get to the aerial battle position that's going to allow them to bring fires, right? There was a beauty when us at the table, just by age, had to fight over the same piece of acetate to get our graphics, because if it didn't get on there, it wasn't true. Or if it didn't get on the single execution matrix or sync matrix, it wasn't true. So I would offer, be disciplined, be ready to do the work, and figure out ways to color on the same page together across the team. Whether that's your company little team you pull together, you RTO first sergeant, or on your staff, you know, pulling the right folks together to be on the same map, same graphic, same coloring page in the coloring book.
I agree that we do a better job of winning at the point of contact when we make contact on our own terms with the enemy that we did probably 4 or 5 years ago. But two things that, while I was the COG, I really had regrets about how I trained my brigade when I was brigade commander and battalion command, company command, et cetera. And those two things were, one, pulling security, because as General Gardner says, I think people understand the need to pull security, but we've got to pull security all the time. And we got, I think a lot of times we'll go out to live fire ranges and we'll do the live fire, do the actions on the objective. And although we fought to the field and we've set up patrol bases and all that, we'll do the run, do a AAR, go back to the patrol base, and no one will be pulling security. And then I think that translates into the rotation with then about a half hour after, or 2 hours, 3 hours after entering the box. If we're not doing an attack or we're not doing the prepared defense, no one's pulling security and everyone dies. Which at JRTC, you know, we're shooting miles and all that stuff is forgivable. But when we're doing this for real, people will really be dead and it won't be forgivable. The other thing is comms. I would have spent way more time training comms because I started calling that the original sin at JRTC, because if you look at the things that would go wrong, we can't synchronize fire and maneuver. Why? Ultimately, we can't talk. Our sustainment plan ends up falling apart. Why? Because units wouldn't turn in their log stats. They wouldn't attend the virtual log sync because they couldn't talk. So if you look at all the things that went wrong, why those things wouldn't happen, why those things happened, oftentimes it would ultimately come down to no one could talk to each other.
Sure, so I still call it the original sin, to stay up with it. And for the company commanders, I would say, shameless, like, carry comp to a 1. If you can't talk to your battalion headquarters, you know, it's not awesome. Colonel Saslov or Major General Doyle, any comments to add on what you saw, where we made improvement, and where you think we're still struggling, sir.
Yeah, what I saw, and it was really through Colonel Sadlov's eyes, was a much more aggressive perspective on taking risk. And it really encouraged me because, you know, at local levels, you know, platoon leaders were seeking the fight. Company commanders were seeking the fight. We were no longer kind of waiting for, you know, the enemy to come to us. But, you know, the challenge associated with that is if you can't talk, if you can't integrate your fire system, then you start having individual platoon fights or individual company fights. Or, you know, sometimes the battalion would be out there fighting and wouldn't be able to harness all the other assets that are available at the BCT level. But the initiative and the aggressiveness changed from the time that I was the COG to what I watched with a lot more units when Colonel Sadlov was the COG, because I think they started doing more of the large-scale combat operations, field time, no kidding, orientation to what it's like to be an infantryman, an infantry person, you know, out in the mix. Now, the security issues that General Curl mentioned were prevalent as well. But again, the translation of understanding and practicing at home station was really starting to manifest itself in a lot more aggression, which is generally a good thing when you're talking about an infantry formation. So I'll pass it over to Colonel Sadlov.
Thanks, sir. Yeah, you know, I think it's important to remember because, you know, we at the CTCs, we publish trends and they don't, from the initial look, they don't seem to change much. But you know, certainly what I realized as a COG is they absolutely have. We as an Army are never satisfied. We as an Army want to be better tomorrow than we were today. And so fires is still one of our trends that we need to get better at it. But, you know, where we were when I was a battalion commander to where we were when I left as a COG, we have grown leaps and bounds. You know, and I'll give you an area that, you know, historically we say we're horrible at the defense in the Army. I actually think over the course of my time as a COG, I saw some pretty good defenses built. Where we were challenged is the integration of those defenses into the systems that were going to help kill the enemy. And that gets into really, you know, what do we got to know better? We know our individual warfighting functions. You know, our company grade officers, they're getting really, really good at understanding the fight at the platoon, company, troop, battery level. Our field grade officers, they understand how to manipulate that warfighting function that they're a part of. But it's that true integration that we got to get to. You know, we still hear constantly, well, we built the ops plan, now we have to build the fires plan, and I passed to the force so he can build the sustainment plan, and the aviators are working on the aviation plan. There are none of those plans exist. There's just the plan. There is a plan, and it's got to be integrated on all warfighting functions so that we're synchronized in time and space. And, you know, for the young lieutenants and captains in the room, what you got to think about in these areas is what are the details that are needed back to my higher headquarters that only I know, right? Consumption rates. We passed to the sustainment enterprise to do the sustainment support to our operations, but unless you're accurately articulating your consumption rates across the classes of supply, they can't plan to support you. And so I think we're getting a lot better. I think we're understanding our individual roles really, really well, but we've got to, you know, like General Gardner said, we've really got to work on the integration of those warfighting functions, that echelon. We've got to understand there's a plan, and it should have all the warfighting functions represented from its inception to its execution.
Gentlemen, thanks. All right, and for the team here, so we've got time. We got about 15 minutes. We've got some time for some questions, and so we'd like to open it up for questions. And so I was a history professor at West Point, so it means I'll stare at you awkwardly if you don't have questions, and we'll get there. Please address your question to someone on the panel.
Gentlemen, Captain Hodgen, MCCC, this is just for the group. Over the past 2 days, several speakers have mentioned that an upcoming LISCO conflict with near peer adversaries that the fight will begin at home station. And so how does JRTC and CPCs across the Army, is there a plan to like imitate that fight at home station during outload?
So one, and you'll hear me talk about like the CTCs and training them a taste of the environment, right? But I guess my point is you as a company commander or you as a brigade commander are not necessarily responsible, other than some basic stuff typically for, security of your aerial port of embarkation, for example. One of the things that we do offer is some different ways that a division can choose to deploy its brigade, so that perhaps you have to pack your containers a little bit differently, so that you have to offload the right stuff, because you don't necessarily have this experience in the room if you're a captain typically, but a lot of the majors and higher, and some of you if you're prior service, remember the days where we threw everything in the containers, we got it over to Afghanistan, Iraq, and we figured it out on that end, right? And it's just not going to work that way. We're going to have to be able to package our stuff for immediate employment upon arrival. So we can make some changes like that the divisions have. And look, we can shoot missiles at you at Fort Bragg or Fort Carson, but that's not necessarily something you can affect, I think, as a company commander.
Anybody here been on Geronimo or been in 11th Regiment? Okay. Which one were you in?
I was in Geronimo, sir.
Okay, so what did Geronimo do to try to get information on the incoming brigade from home station before they ever set foot on Fort Polk?
Yeah, so before the rotation even starts, I'd say it starts at the battalion op order. That's where we look up all the information, task organization, who the actual leaders are, social media, what the Army Times has posted about certain units. Are they ready to take on Geronimo? It's a whole bunch of research in depth on who we're fighting and figure out their capabilities and limitations, what we can expect to see in the box. And then we utilize our own capabilities to negate that. The biggest one was always the Apaches, but it's just a bunch of research before the RSO5 process even begins.
And then when we added our cyber teams in, without doing anything exquisite on unclassified networks, in a couple of cases, got the plan from the home station networks. So that's that pressure probably still happens. And so that's a good reminder for your team to practice OPSEC, and it will have a real impact on a rotation. Might be an opportunity for deception too. Put a deception plan out there and let Geronimo buy it, hook, line, and sinker, and see what that does. But you've hit on something that's on a lot of people's minds. I've been a senior commander of installations twice now, and that's a huge focal point. What do we do in a major outload, a major mobilization to protect those deployment nodes, to make sure we can still project combat power and do so with some measure of OPSEC and without disruption. So. Tough challenge.
Other questions?
Sir, Major Baker, I'm from the Mission Command seated at Fort Leavenworth. This may actually be for you, but as JRTC and all the CTCs collect a lot of data, what are the CTCs doing to help the .mil-PF analysis through almost like predictive, like we see these trends, as I think John Doyle mentioned, they don't really change much or seem to, maybe just vary. What is the underlying cause that's causing those trends? We all kind of instinctively know it might be something at home station, lack of time to train or whatnot. Is there any actual analytical rigor that goes in that you guys at the CTCs may be able to help provide the modernization force for?
Hey, Matt, can I jump in on that?
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, so this is Major General Doyle, and you are exactly right. There is a repository of data that exists at all the CTCs that's just staggering. But unfortunately, it's kind of unformatted data. It's in a variety of different, methods, and some of it's, AARs that are just PowerPoint deep. So one of the things that Joe Gardner is doing is he's bringing in ORSTA, an operational research system analysis person on staff. And we're going to start, hopefully, this is the plan. So Dave, if I'm wrong, you can correct me. But start doing the labeling, start doing the identification of trends, and start giving concrete data-informed feedback to leaders to make assessments on whether our POIs are correct in, the maneuver captain's course, or we need to make adjustments with the PEOs and how they're fielding and getting training done for new equipment. And, a lot of what we do right now is intuitive and based on leadership and experience, but I believe that if we can cull the data and show the Army more accurately different ways of doing business, we'll get better results. So, I think JRTC is on the leading edge of that. I think the other CTCs are starting to look at it as an option. And then once we standardize the data, I think it'll be even more useful. That's not the only thing. I mean, we still need good leaders to exercise good judgment. But we do collect all that data. We might as well put it to good use. So, Joe Gardner, am I on track, or did I kind of wave off on that?
No, sir, we're doing that exact thing.
Hey, and to the question of why these things are staying the same, and to Colonel Saslav talked about how they're staying the same, but they're getting better. The trends are the same, but we're improving in each of those categories. But the thing is, most people go into a CTC rotation, it's their first time at a CTC rotation in that job. And so they're making the same mistake that the people before them made because it was the first time they did it in that job. So it sounds like we're being kind of negative here, but we are improving. But the thing is, all of those things are really easy to talk about in the classroom here, but then actually doing them on the ground, synchronizing 6 warfighting functions in time and space while making contact with the enemy, getting very little sleep is really difficult.
Yeah, and just 2 quick things. One, I think that's a great value of, as a captain after company command, coming to a CTC to be an OCT, is you somewhat mitigate what General Curl just said, because you then can start to observe the things you'll need to do as a battalion field grade. And so when you do come back as an S3 or XO, you will have seen that already. Like the quote yesterday, prefer to learn from others. But on .mil-PF, I'll tell you a quick story, which is also why it's awesome to be at a CTC. How many of you have used Casualty Cards? Anybody yet? Have you used the ones with the pictures of wounds? Okay, so let me tell you a quick story. So either under General Bernabe or General Doyle, JRTC OCTs like you actually invented those and said, hey, this is telling me nothing, because we used to have these ones, it was a little black and white stick figure with an X, right? And they figured out that no, give the CLS or give the medic the picture and make them figure it out. That's training, right? Well, we forgot about it because stuff happens, right? NTC started using them, implementing them. While I was at COG, we talked to NTC, we got their TTPs back. Command Sergeant Major Wilson was with me in the room, and I showed him the General Funk. And I said, sir, look at what we're doing here. And I told him the story. He looked at his team. It's only been not even a year and a half since that, or two years since that happened, maybe 2.5 at most. I now have a box of training development, and the casualty cards are totally new. That's the power of the CTCs, in a different answer to your question, to impact training across the entire Army. That's the impact, frankly, that a couple of captains, in this case, they were medical and logistics, but the same thing happens with all MOSs. That's what captains and sergeants first classes are doing for our Army at the CTCs, this outsized impact on how to make things better.
Yeah, I was always amazed at the number of folks from all over the enterprise who would descend upon a rotation out of Futures Command, the Army G6, G8. And, at first you're like, holy cow, look at all these visitors with high rank that all, add some friction. But it didn't take long to figure out, now they bring a lot of value for our Army as they come in with trained eyes, trained collectors, looking at all parts of the operation, all warfighting functions, all with an idea of taking that and rolling it into a better capability or improved capability for our Army in the future. So that's all going on now. There's no doubt there's all kinds of data there that's not labeled well. And, we've got different bucket names for, between the CTCs with different types of data. So there's some work that we need to do there for sure. But I do think as an Army, we are putting a lot of people at each of these rotations to glean lessons and apply them to the future. Thanks.
Gentlemen, Lieutenant Colonel Wellington, Division 3. I have a question for General Bernabe regarding command posts. One of the biggest lessons learned, obviously, that we're paying attention to from Ukraine is the vulnerability of our command posts. And I think it's a very difficult problem for BCT commanders getting ready to go through a CTC rotation who have been equipped and trained to set up a command post in a certain way, and now they're being told, hey, don't do that anymore. It's a bad idea, and you're going to pay a price if you do it that way. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the way forward as we try to innovate and find solutions to the problem.
Yeah, I get lots of thoughts, and I've taken some action here.
After you, Andy's a good guy to talk to.
Yeah. So we finished Warfighter 21-4 as a division, and at the final AR, I tasked the division staff, said, okay, we must take our command posts, and they must become mobile, agile, modular, therefore smaller, and therefore hopefully survivable. That's at the division level. We started a campaign of learning immediately to do the same thing, to do that across the division, and where possible inside the brigade combat team. We got some challenges there in terms of having platforms, vehicular platforms and equipment to actually accomplish that. So at the division level, what did that look like? Well, it started by realizing that not everybody can have a seat in a mobile command post at the division level. In fact, about 46%, I think, was all we could fit in mobile platforms. And so you got to kind of change the way you fight at the division level. So some part of it, if we assume everybody on the division MTO is of some use to the warfight, then they got to be able to contribute from somewhere. So now you've got a reach back capability in some form of sanctuary. Now, maybe that's still in a tent somewhere. Maybe if we're fighting in Lithuania, that's a tent in Wiesbaden, Germany, or maybe it's in a command post at Fort Bliss, Texas. But then but we had to get really creative with the platforms we did have, Expando vans and some smaller, MATVs and Bergs and some other things that are out there to try to come up with a way to modularize and then practice to make it agile. What's one of the best ways to speed up the displacement drill for a CP? Practice it on the clock every time. And you can add the pressure of indirect fire and even direct fire and all that, but with an op sergeant major and a stopwatch and just the idea that we're going to make this better. Okay, team, that took us 10 hours to displace the main and establish it. Not good enough. We're going to do it again in 5 hours. Ready, set, go. What do our soldiers do? What do our non-commissioned officers do? They innovate. They find efficiencies. They realize, hey, maybe we don't need all 5 coffee pots. Maybe we can get by with 1, or maybe we don't have one at all. They realize, holy crap, these 5K of Cat 5 cable that we got to have for a brigade talk, we can't sustain this. So there's got to be a better way to connect ourselves other than 5K's worth of Cat 5 cable we got to unroll every time we set this thing up. So by doing some of that in 1st Armor Division, they've been able to pare down and come up with a solution that's much smaller, much more mobile and agile, and then they just exercise it at NTC. At the brigade combat team level, we haven't helped you out much with facilities. But I think it starts with rethinking how can you still command and control a formation, but be survivable. I watched one brigade do this, and if you look at the trends, that I listed in 2016, that this is it's the number 3 trend on there. And by the way, it continued with Dave Doyle after me. And so I talked to brigades, before they came into the box. And one of the brigades in particular said, hey, we're going to beat this trend. We're going to survive. And that was the only rotation in my time there where Geronimo never found the brigade top. Never found it. They used what we started to call the Smurf Village approach, where they took their main and created these nodes and tucked them away in the trees, well dispersed by as much as 400 or 500 meters at sometimes. And Geronimo was never able to find them. The drawback was, as soon as it rained, they stopped talking and collaborating to each other, because suddenly that 500 meters became like 500 miles. And so there's some human nature that you've got to uncover. And the only way you do that is you got to, again, we called it a experiment in learning at Fort Bliss. Just by trying, we're just going to do this, we're going to try it, we're going to do it and do it and do it again, and see what kind of innovation we come up with. If you haven't, there's a lot of talk about this. You read John Antall's book, 7 Seconds to Die. There's plenty of examples in there and things that make you go, huh, we got to change the way we do business. Masking, ways to mask the signature of those CPs in all spectrum. So I don't know that I've answered your question, other than we got a lot of work to do, and it's going to take us all working in parallel. As I was talking about with General White about what we were doing at 1st Armor Division, he gave me some good counsel and coaching. He said, hey, don't get overly focused on form. You've got to work function. I think one of our challenges up till now is that we spend so much time working the function part, and we say, we'll get to form later, and we never get there. We change out the team, the next rotation is a year away or 2 years away, and we never get there. So we made a decision at 1st Armor Division a year ago. We're going to do both, form and function, and see if we can't improve the survivability of at least that CP. The subordinate brigades in 1st Armor are starting to tackle it as well, but again, we haven't done a lot to help them in terms of facilities or bright ideas. I'm confident that as all brigades around the Army tackle this, we're gonna see some things emerge.
Thanks, gentlemen. I'm going to give them a moment to pause and transition out.
Yeah.
Great to see everybody here.
Now you can talk about us. Okay, thanks, bro.
All right, and so I'm going to turn it over to Colonel Saslov. 82nd has been doing a lot of great stuff with command posts. And so Colonel Saslov.
Hey, thanks, Matt. It's gonna sound a lot like what you just heard, but first of all, I think first thing we got to do is think about what our command posts have to be. They have to be close, but I don't think they need to be contiguous. Our command posts have to process sustainment, CUOPs, the future plan, and at the brigade level, right, that's at the battalion level, at the brigade level, it's got to have plans, short-term, future CUOP, and sustainment. So four areas of the brigade, I think 3 areas of the battalion level that have to happen in every command post. Usually we talk TAC, talk main command post, to talk about what functions you have to accomplish inside of those. It's gotta include all the warfighting functions. If you want to do current operations, you have to have the warfighting functions. If you want to successfully do future operations, you have to include all the warfighting functions. So what gets in our way? What gets in our way of making them smaller, making them more agile? We talked about it, right? One of it is MCoE. If you go to a brigade talk, the largest signature is actually the vehicles, and it's because we've equipped the brigade with a lot of Humvees and not a lot of LMTVs, right? So it takes 5 vehicles that equate to what could move inside of 1 LMTV. So how do you look at your vehicular plan and how you can adjust that to lower your signature? Your tents should be temporary. They should be something that is a stopgap when you can't get into something that has overhead cover. If you can get into the basement of a building, think about all the levels of protection you have from direct and indirect fire. And so tents should be temporary, but one of the things that we've got 2 brigades in the field right now for culminating training. One of the things that one of the BCTs is doing that I think is really helping speed up their movement is, that 5 kilometers of Cat 5 cable we talked about. Every cord or cabling requirement they have they have two of, right? So their tents are all pre-configured, they're pre-wired, but they've also got a tough box. That's another series of cables that's labeled so that they can rapidly move from tentage into a hard stand and back, and they can adjust. So in the areas that you have the flexibility, how can you create redundancy in your systems so that you can have things pre-configured for two different types of occupation requirements? You gotta, command posts, I think at the CTC, I would say, are placed in matters of convenience, right? We send out a quartering party, they drive down the road, they look at a spot that will be easy and will fit everything nicely. And those places generally tend to be large open areas close to the road. And the reason Geronimo finds them is because they're in the same place as the last brigade, and the brigade before that, and the brigade before that, right? You know, we were doing west to east rotations at JRTC for a while, and we had to start closing off sections of the box because so many command posts had gone there that it started to become a hygiene issue, right? Because we're digging cat trenches and the gray water. So your command post, if you go back, you know, for the lieutenants in the room that are in the basic course, think about where you're told to put a patrol base, right? It's got to be off natural lines of drift. It's got to be in a place that offers you natural cover and concealment. That should apply to your command post. And so analysis needs to go into this process, right? It needs to start with a line of sight analysis. Can the brigade talk to the battalions? And can the battalions talk back to the brigade and down to their companies? And so as the brigade plans for command posts, it's planning for them, it's planning down to their subordinates, and it's doing that through a line of sight analysis to understand where they can talk and connect. And then it's looking for places that are easily covered and concealed, that are off natural lines of drift. It can't be a matter of convenience. And then you got to rehearse it. And, you know, units will often come to the CTCs, and if they have rehearsed their command posts, it's generally like during the week, and who really rehearsed is like the 3 specialists, 2 sergeants, and 1 private that's in the HHC. Who needs to rehearse are the majors and the sergeant's major and the captains and the lieutenants who all work inside that command post, because those are the ones who are going to tear it up or tear it down and set it back up. And so you've got to rehearse with the whole team so you understand what's our bus to seat ratio and how can I minimize the number of vehicles needed to accomplish that. How are we going to occupy, and do I have each of the warfighting functions represented in a way that'll support 24-hour operations, but is as small as we can possibly go. Over.
Awesome. Gentlemen, we are at time. I'm going to stand by here and others for questions. But I would be remiss. So first to Major General Doyle, sir, thanks for putting this together and having the awesome idea. Colonel Sislov, thanks for joining. For everybody that came, greatly appreciate you coming. I've got Sergeant Major Hanson here. I've got Captain Drew Mueller here. Happy to stand by and talk CTC, JRTC with you after. What I would commend to you is as a 2-time offender of the CTCs, 19 rotations at the National Training Center as a Tarantula 07 and Bronco 07, and then over at JRTC. These are a difference maker for our Army. Hugely humbling to be an OCT. What I found my 3rd rotation was the mistakes that I made as a battalion commander with fires. I questioned whether somebody should have let me command a battalion. And so the opportunity to come to a CTC and learn your craft, really a deepening assignment, hugely rewarding what you get to do in helping units get better, hugely rewarding in what you get to do in helping to develop other officers and non-commissioned officers, and hugely, I think, beneficial to what you will get out of it for yourself and learn our craft and our warfighting. All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time.